Chapter 12 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Death and Resurrection. Bach enjoyed all his life the best of health. He seems never to have been seriously ill. In the summer of 1729, we learn this accidentally. He had an indisposition that came at an inconvenient time for him, since it prevented him from visiting Handel, who was at that time in Halle. Yet the state of his eyes was always rather unsatisfactory. Bach was extremely short-sighted. He never spared his eyes. In his youth he sat up, as we learn from the Necrology and from Forkel, whole nights through, copying music. The demands he made on his visual powers in later times were hardly less. They must thus have steadily deteriorated. This is probably one of the main reasons for the slackening in his productivity from about 1740 onwards. At the end, he was attacked by a painful malady of the eyes. He was operated upon, partly from the desire to go on serving God and his neighbor with his still active mental and physical powers, partly on the advice of some of his friends who placed much faith in an oculist lately arrived in Leipzig. Yet this operation, although it had to be repeated, turned out very badly. He not only lost his sight, but his otherwise exceedingly good bodily health was quite undermined by it, and by some mischievous medicines and other treatment, so that for a full half-year afterwards he was almost continually ailing. During his illness he went on with the revision of his great chorale fantasias, which had already occupied him for some time. The manuscript, part of the property left by Emmanuel, tells a story of suffering. In the second version of the chorale, Jesus Christus unser Heiland, appears the handwriting of Altnicol, who had become Bach's son-in-law in 1749. Then we meet again with Bach's clear characters. He even found the strength to make a new and improved fair copy of the canonic variations on Vom Himmel hoch da komm ich her, which he had had engraved and published in 1747 on joining the Miesler Society. He appears to have passed his last days wholly in a darkened room. When he felt death drawing nigh, he dictated to Altnicol a chorale fantasia on the melody Wenn wir in Hochsten Noten sind, but told him to head it with the beginning of the hymn For deinen Thron tritt ich allhier, that is sung to the same melody. In the manuscript we can see all the pauses that the sick man had to permit himself, the drying ink becoming more watery from day to day. The notes written in the twilight, with the windows closely curtained, can hardly be deciphered. In the dark chamber, with the shades of death already falling round him, the master made this work that is unique even among his creations. The contrapuntal art that it reveals is so perfect that no description can give any idea of it. Each segment of the melody is treated in a fugue, in which the inversion of the subject figures each time as the counter-subject. Moreover, the flow of the parts is so easy that after the second line we are no longer conscious of the art, but are wholly enthralled by the spirit that finds voice in these G major harmonies. The tumult of the world no longer penetrated through the curtained windows. The harmonies of the spheres were already echoing round the dying master. So there is no sorrow in the music. The tranquil quavers move along on the other side of all human passion. Over the whole thing gleams the word transfiguration. Bach's eyes all at once seemed to improve. On waking one morning he could see quite well and could endure the light. A few hours later he had a stroke. This was followed, says the Necrology, by a violent fever, in which, in spite of all possible care on the part of two of the ablest physicians in Leipzig, he gently and blissfully passed away on the 28th of July, 1750, at 8:45 in the evening, in the 66th year of his age. The burial took place at St. John's Cemetery on the morning of Friday the 31st, the second day of humiliation in Saxony. Bach was universally lamented. Magister Abraham Kriegel, his colleague at St. Thomas's School, eulogized him in an obituary notice, Telemann, the famous musician, eulogized him in the following sonnet: Last wechelnd immer viel von virtuosen Sagen, die durch die Klingenkunst sich dort berühmt gemacht. Auf deutschen Boden sind sei gleichwohl zu erfragen, wo man des Beifalls sei nicht minder fähig acht. Erblichener Bach, dir hat allein dein Orgel schlagen, das edel Vorgutswort des großen Langs gebracht, und was für Kunst dein Kiel aus Notenblatt getragen, das Wort mit höchster Lust, auch oft mit Neid betracht. So schaffte dein Name bleibt von Untergange frei, die Schule deine Sucht und ihre Schulerei, bereiten für dein Haupt des Nachruhms Ehrenkrone. Auch deine klinde Haut setzt ihren Schmuck daran. Doch was in Sodenberg dicht schatzbar machen kann, das zeiget in Berlin in einem würdigen Sonne. Emmanuel and Agricola were commissioned to write the necrology which the Miesler Society wished to devote to its member. It appeared in 1754. This necrology contains the best-known anecdotes, the fate of the music books in which the boy had copied out music at night, the contest with Marchand, the masterly organ performance before Reinken, the visit to Frederick the Great. It also gives the first list of the printed and unprinted works. The deceased members of the musical society were, in addition, commemorated in a Singedicht. The composition of the one for Bach was entrusted to a Dr. Georg Wensky. It is not exactly a masterpiece. First of all, the muses were involved. Chorus: Dampft Musen ever Seitenspiel, brecht ab die Freudenlieder, steckt dem Vergnügen itzt ein Ziel, und singt zum Trost betrübter Brudet, hort was für Klagen Leipzig singt, es wird euch storen, doch müsst ihr hören. Then Leipzig appears and announced in a recitative: Der große Bach der unserer Stadt, ja der Europens weite Reiche, erob und wenig seine starke hat, ist leider eine Leiche. After the composers and friends of music have given vent to their grief in rhyme, the members of the musical society, as the true initiates, finally break out into a song of lamentation in the form of a two-part aria. At the end, the glorified one speaks. He comforts the friends with the reflection that the musical conditions in heaven are better than those in Leipzig, whereupon the chorus brings the Singedicht to an end. Mattheson, the leading critic of that time, made an end after Bach's death of the secret envy he had cherished towards him all his life long, and wrote in warm praise of the art of fugue, which appeared in 1751. Johann Sebastian Bach's so-called art of fugue, he writes in the same year, a practical and splendid, praktisches und praktiges work of 70-folio copperplates, will astonish all the French and Italian fugue writers, provided they can understand it. I will not say be able to play it. How would it be then if every German and every foreigner should venture his louis d'or on his treasure? Germany is and remains, without doubt, the true land of organ music and fugue. The same note had been struck by the celebrated Berlin musical theorist Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg (1718 1795) in the preface that he wrote to the Art of Fugue at Emmanuel's request, although he had been a pupil not of Bach but of Rameau in Paris. It would be a great mistake, however, to imagine that Bach was at that time regarded as one of the leading German composers. It was the organist who was famous, the theoretician of the fugue was admired, but the composer of the passions and cantatas was only incidentally mentioned. In the same volume of the Miesler Bibliothek that contains the necrology, there is a list of the artists who constituted the glory of German music. They come in the following order: Hasse, Handel, Telemann, the two Grauns, Stölzel, Bach, Pisendel, Quanz, and Bumler. Bach's fame made hardly any advance during the 18th century. Johann Adam Hiller, in his Lebensbeschreibung berühmter Musikgelehrter 1784 allotted him only a few superficial pages, which moreover dealt only with the corypheus of all organists, and Gerber in his Tonkünstlerlexikon does not take the slightest trouble to appreciate the composer as well as the virtuoso. For all that, we must not be unjust to those who did not recognize his greatness at that time. They were not to blame, they could not do otherwise. In the first place, we must take into consideration the artistic ideal of the men of that epoch. They were too simple to rank the art of the previous generation as highly as that of their own. They were convinced that music was always advancing, and as their own art was later than the old art, it must necessarily come nearer to the ideal. That epoch could not resign itself to regarding mere performers of other men's work as artists. If a man wished to appear before the public, it should be with works of his own. So implicitly was this principle accepted that many people did not hesitate to perform the works of others under their own name. It was only when musicians began to recognize that other men's living thoughts were better than their own dead ones, and to be content with being purely executive artists, that the past ceased to be regarded as surpassed by the present. This, however, was not until the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th, but until it happened, Bach's day could not possibly come. Nor must we forget that even during the master's lifetime art had taken a path that led it far away from cantatas and passions. People were weary of fugues and of pieces constructed of obbligato parts, and longed for a music that could be spontaneous, feeling, and nothing else. The conception of nature which, in the epoch of growing rationalism, transformed philosophy and poetry, asserted itself also in music. Answering as they did to the needs of the epoch, the emotional compositions of the day, with their tender and pathetic expression, insignificant as they were in themselves, appealed to thoughtful artists as being nearer to truth than the music of the epoch of rigid rule. That Bach's art is in its own way was also true to nature, and that in his strict polyphony a volcanic emotion and thought were embedded, like substances petrified in lava. This the men of the expiring 18th century could not see. There has never been a movement so lacking in the historical sense as the rationalism of the 18th century. The art of the past in every department is regarded as mere affectation. Everything old was necessarily antiquated, at least in its form. If they were to appreciate its utterance, it must be expressed in a simpler and more natural way. In this spirit, they restored so much of the ancient buildings as they allowed to remain. In this spirit did the Bach admirers of that epoch, among them his own sons and Zelter, undertake revisions of his works that are among the most barbarous things of their kind in the whole world. Zelter in particular discovered French powder in Bach's pigtail. Old Bach, he writes in one place, is, with all his originality, a son of his country and of his epoch, and did not escape the influence of the French, especially of Couperin. People try to be agreeable, and so write what cannot last. This alien product, however, we can skim off him like a thin froth, bringing out the real worth of what lies immediately underneath. I have arranged in this way many of his church pieces for myself alone, and my heart tells me that old Bach nods approvingly at me, like the good Haydn. Yes, yes, that is just what I wanted. Bach's sons were the children of their epoch, and never understood their father. It was only from piety that they looked at him with childlike admiration. This remark of Eitner, severe as it may be, is true. The London Bach was even lacking in piety. He spoke of his father as the old Perruque. In the eyes of the public and the critics of the end of the 18th century, the great composer of the Bach family was Emmanuel. No one stood so much in the way of his father's name as he. Burney, 1726 to 1814, the celebrated English critic, who visited him on his great continental tour in 1772, extols him as one of the greatest composers for keyed instruments that ever lived, and is of opinion that he is not only more learned than his father, but is far before him in variety of modulation. He makes only casual mention of the fact that Emmanuel had showed him the 2 volumes of the Well-Tempered Clavichord. They were compositions that the deceased Herr Kapellmeister had written on purpose for him when he was a boy. Burney was several days in Hamburg and spent almost the whole time with Emmanuel. The latter, however, did not play him a single note of his father's music. In a conversation with his visitor, Emmanuel made merry over the composers who affected canons, and said it was ever a certain proof to him of a total want of genius in any one that was fond of such wretched studies and undermeaning productions. On the other hand, he praised Hasse, the greatest cheat in the world, who in his compositions, without considering the obbligato leading of the parts, made such divine effects as one could never expect from a crowded score. This points to a quite new conception of orchestral composition, which was afterwards realized in the Beethoven symphony, but at the same time it shows the son's complete lack of understanding of the character of his father's scores. For Reichardt, the greatest critical authority of that epoch, old Bach ranks considerably below Handel, though both are reproached with clinging to old forms. The only man who ventured to place Bach above Handel at that time was an enthusiastic anonymous author of an article in the Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliothek upon Bach's piano and organ works. Bach's case was greatly prejudiced by the German Handel worship that dated from the first Berlin performance of the Messiah under Hiller, 19th May 1786, especially as Hiller became cantor at St. Thomas's, Leipzig, in 1789, where for 10 years he worked for Handel and his own teacher Hasse, as if a Johann Sebastian Bach had never existed. When he had completed his own collection of motets and was desirous of doing still more to increase the supply of good church music, it did not occur to him to publish the few cantatas of Bach that lay in the musical library of the Cantorate, but only to issue the finest pieces from Hasse's Italian operas, with a German church text added to them. The clergy of the town took the greatest interest in this undertaking. We learn from Zelter that Hiller tried to inspire the Thomaners with abhorrence of the crudities of Bach. The only cantor of St. Thomas's of the second half of the 18th century who did anything for Bach was Dolus, and he only half-heartedly. Although he had actually been Bach's pupil, he made a rule for himself when writing contrapuntally, to observe its proper limits and at the same time not to forget delicate and affecting melody, in which he took Hasse and Graun as his models. Nevertheless, as we know from Rochlitz, who was a Thomaner under him, from time to time he performed works by Bach, among them certain motets and passions. It was through Dolus that Mozart, who revered and loved him, made the acquaintance of Bach's motet Singet dem Herrn ein neues Lied. Rochlitz, who was present at that performance, gives the following account of it. Mozart knew Bach more by hearsay than from his works. At any rate, he was quite ignorant of his motets, which had never been printed. Scarcely had the choir sung a few bars when he started up, a few bars more, and he called out, "What is that?" And now his whole soul seemed to be in his ears. When the performance was over, he called out joyfully, "That is indeed something from which we can learn." He was told that this school at which Sebastian Bach had been cantor possessed a complete collection of his motets and treasured them as sacred relics. "That's right, that's fine," he said, "let me see them." As there were no scores of these works, he got them to bring him the separate parts, and now it was a joy to the silent observers to see how eagerly Mozart distributed the parts around him, in both hands, on his knees, on the nearest chairs, and forgetting everything else, did not rise until he had carefully read through everything that was there of Bach's. He begged and obtained a copy for himself, which he valued very highly. The one who seemed in the best position to produce Bach's cantatas was Emmanuel, who was church music director at Hamburg. So far as we know, however, he performed only a few cantatas and sections of the B minor Mass. In any case, he would not have been able to do much for his father's works, even if he had wished, for his chorus and orchestra were in a sorry state. Burney laments that a piece of church music which he heard in St. Catherine's, it was one of Emmanuel's own, should have been done so very badly, and that the congregation should have listened to it so inattentively. Nothing remained in Hamburg at that time of the old enthusiasm for church music. "You should have come here 50 years ago," said Emmanuel sadly to his visitor. It is evident, too, that the discussions upon the reform of church music after his death, that people had taken his productions of his father's work in ill part. At any rate, the pastors were forced to defend him against the reproach that many old compositions had been used, and with them also an old and often unedifying text. His apologists excused him on the ground that it could not be otherwise with the excessive quantity of music. How little interest was felt in religious art is shown by the fact that the College of Sexagenarians abolished the regular Sunday music from motives of economy, retaining only the music of the 6 feast days. Conditions were no better in the other German towns. The regular music was abolished. The cantorate choirs were mostly extinct. Voluntary mixed choirs scarcely existed as yet, and were not permitted in the church service. Bach's cantatas were really impossible in the churches by reason not only of their music, but of their old orthodox texts. We must bear all this in mind before we speak of the lack of understanding of the musicians who let Bach's works fall into oblivion. Religious music was possible only outside the church service, and even this had to be of the kind in which the effect depended more on the chorale masses than on the text. For this reason, Handel, the oratorio composer, triumphed over Bach, the master of the cantata. The reaction against rationalistic spiritual poetry had to be far advanced before the public could again tolerate a Bach text. Even if anyone, in despite of the epoch, had wished to give Bach's work, he could hardly have done so, for the simple reason that they were nowhere to be had. The possessors of the 5 yearly series of cantatas were Emmanuel and Friedemann, who had divided the treasure among them. Those in Friedemann's hands were soon dispersed. Emmanuel took more care of his. To publish them, however, was impossible, on account of the expense, nor would he have found many purchasers. His unfortunate experience with the art of fugue, of which by the autumn of 1756 only 30 copies had been sold, was not encouraging. So he confined himself to lending the scores of the cantatas to the few people who were interested in them for inspection or for copying, for which they had to pay him a fee, not even Forkel, his friend, being excepted. After his death his wife continued the business. When she died in 1795, Anna Carolina, the sole surviving granddaughter of Johann Sebastian Bach, appended to the obituary notice in the papers an announcement that she would continue with the utmost attentiveness the business hitherto carried on by her late mother with the music of her late father and grandfather. In Leipzig there were the parts of the motets which belonged to the school, 3 Passions and some cantatas. These were probably the works that Bach's widow offered to the council in 1752 when she applied for relief. The works of Bach in the possession of Amalie, the sister of Frederick the Great and a pupil of Kirnberger, were temporarily withdrawn from publicity, and were known only to a few intimate friends. After her death in 1787, her collection went to the library of the Joachimsthal Gymnasium in Berlin. The piano and organ works were hardly more widely diffused. Of those that had been engraved, there had always been so few copies that they were scarcely better known than those which, in Bach's lifetime, circulated only in manuscript. It is hardly credible how little was known of Bach by those who spoke admiringly of him. It had always been so. Marburg's celebrated treatise on fugue, according to the principles and examples of the best German and foreign masters, gives us the impression that apart from the art of fugue he had not seen many fugues of Bach, yet he refers enthusiastically to him in his practice. The chorale preludes again he scarcely knew, judging by the way in which he speaks of them. The Well-Tempered Clavichord was perhaps the most widely known work. But at the end of the 18th century it seemed on the whole as if Bach were forever dead. At the very beginning of the 19th century, however, there was felt the breath of the spirit that was to wake him to immortal life in his works. In 1802 Forkel's biography appeared. This marks the turning of the tide. Johann Nicolaus Forkel, 1749 to 1818, was the university musical director at Göttingen. He was also a musical historian, engaged on a general history of music that was to extend from the foundation of the world to his own time. As he feared that he might die before he got as far as Bach, and he thought it imperative that he should preserve for the world what he had learned of the master from his 2 sons, he decided to anticipate and publish the chapters in Bach, especially as the Bureau de Musique of Hofmeister and Kühnel in Leipzig was planning an edition of Bach's work. His biography was to prepare for and justify that undertaking. The significance of this work of 69 pages does not lie in what it actually says, although it contains plenty of interesting things, nor chiefly in the fact that it made the world for the first time acquainted with Bach and his art, but in the conquering enthusiasm that animates it. Forkel appealed to the national sentiment. The works that Johann Sebastian Bach has left us, he says at the beginning of his preface, are a priceless national heritage of a kind that no other race possesses. And again, the preservation of the memory of this great man is not merely a concern of art, it is a concern of the nation. The book closes with the words, "And this man, the greatest musical poet and the greatest musical rhetorician that has ever existed, and probably that ever will exist, was a German. Be proud of him, O fatherland, be proud of him, but also be worthy of him." Zelter goes astray when he imagines that Forkel had written a life of Bach without knowing more about it than the whole world knew already. No one before him had understood as he did the greatness of the Leipzig master. It is true that he treats of the creator of the cantatas and the passions very briefly. But this was for the simple reason that Forkel had seen only a few of these works. If Forkel was the first Bach biographer, Rochlitz was the first Bach aesthetician. He tells in really thrilling style the story of how he came to Bach. The fact that as a boy he had sung in Bach's motets and passions at St. Thomas's had merely made him scared of the master and his works. As a young man he feels himself attracted to him by a vague enthusiasm, and he studies the four-part chorale movements in the cantatas that Emmanuel had published. Light does not dawn on him, however, for in the absence of the text in this edition he does not understand what Bach is aiming at. From these he goes not knowing of the existence of the inventions to the well-tempered clavichord. Against the pieces in this collection that pleases him he makes a mark. At first there are very few of these. With further acquaintance several more are added, then still more, till at last in the first part about half, and in the second part perhaps two-thirds, have their mark in the margin. Then he ventures on the vocal compositions, and now Father Bach appears to him as the Albrecht Dürer of German music, since he chiefly attains the great expression by the profound development and inexhaustible combination of simple ideas. In this he contrasts Bach with the moderns of his own time, as one of the old masters whom one discovers when one seeks the way that leads from the art that pleases to that which contents. But, he confesses, we must, to be sure, first of all, get used to these old masters. It depends on them as well as on us. His analysis of the St. John Passion and the cantata Ein Feste Burg are masterpieces of aesthetic criticism. The finest thing about them is their immediate freshness. He pronounces judgments towards which he has slowly and painfully worked his way, and which he is almost afraid to set forth, for even to himself they seem too astonishing. He ventures to set Bach above Handel, for his parts always move so independently and yet work together with such marvellous unity as is hardly ever attained by other composers. If Handel is more splendid, Bach is truer. If one is Dürer, the other is a Rubens. It is rarely, he goes on to say, that Bach pleases immediately, rarely that he works directly on the emotions. He addresses himself to the active, inflammable, and penetrating representative reason. This gives the hearer the satisfaction that comes from a perception of the truth. And the first Bach aesthetician says of the recitatives of the St. John Passion, "This truth, this sincerity, this clear delineation of characters and events merely by tones and rhythms, this art that is apparently simple and hidden, and yet is so rich, deep, and manifest, who has ever exhibited this, precisely this, more perfectly? Who can even imagine it being exhibited more perfectly?" Bach's time is therefore bound to come. Rochlitz does not feel that it is now close. He rather believes that it will be delayed. He remarks that the first enthusiasm of 1800, when the rolling wheel of fate for a brief moment brought the spoke of the Reverend Father Sebastian Bach to the highest point, is stifled. The projected edition of Bach's works did not come to anything, and many people no longer saw any practical object in publishing his complete works. However, he recommended it, apart from any practical object, to the future. Since the revolution of things brings to the top again, after a shorter or longer interval, all the main manifestations of the greater human spirits. This perception does honour to the artist Rochlitz, equally honourable to Rochlitz, the man in his care of Bach's last child. When he learned that Regina Susanna, who had been 8 years old at the death of her father, was in want, he published an appeal in the May number of the Musikalische Zeitung for 1800, which runs thus: "Rarely have I taken up the pen with so much alacrity as now, for scarcely ever could I, in confidence in the goodness of men, be so firmly convinced of doing something useful with it as now. The family of the Bachs has become extinct with the exception of one daughter of the great Sebastian. And this daughter, now very old, this daughter is starving. Very few people know it, for she cannot, no, she must not, shall not beg. She shall not do so, for surely people will listen to this appeal for her support. Surely there are still good men who will consider, not me, how could I hope for that, but a fitting occasion to see that the last twig of so fruitful a stem does not perish without care. If every one who has learned something from the Bachs would give only the smallest trifle, how comfortably and free from care would the good woman be able to spend her last years. As one of the first who had learned from Bach, Beethoven sent his contribution. A year later he gave Breitkopf and Hartel a work to publish for the same good object. There were also other donors, so that enough was got together to set the remainder of the life of Bach's daughter free from galling care. Beethoven had made the acquaintance of Bach through his born teacher, Christian Gottlob Neefe, 1748 to 1798. When still a boy he studied the well-tempered clavichord, which in after years he used to call his musical Bible. It was he who said, "Nicht Bach, mir sollte heißen." At the end of his life he planned an overture on the name of Bach. Zelter won two friends for Bach, Goethe and the youthful Mendelssohn. He himself had had to struggle to understand Bach, and had only gradually comprehended that, as he writes to his friend on the 9th of June, 1827, Bach was a poet of the first order. He closes this letter, which branches out into quite a dissertation on Bach, with the remark: "When everything has been weighed that can be said against him, this Leipzig cantor is a sign from God, clear yet inexplicable, to which he does not forget to add proudly that he might say to him, Du hast mir Arbeit gemacht, ich habe dich wieder ans Licht gebracht. Thou hast given me work, I have brought thee to the light." Goethe listens willingly. Zelter sends him the well-tempered clavichord. Schutz, the organist at Birka, plays to him from it, whereupon something of the greatness of the old master dawns upon him. On 21st of June 1827 he writes, "I expressed it to myself, as if the eternal harmony were communing with itself, as might have happened in God's bosom shortly before the creation of the world. It was thus that my inner depth was stirred, and I seemed neither to possess nor to need ears, still less eyes, or any other sense. When the young Mendelssohn was staying with him in May 1830, he had to play to Goethe a good deal of Bach. He remarked of the overture to an orchestral suite in D major, which his guest played on the piano for him. The opening is so pompous and so important that one can really see a file of trim people going down a great staircase." Zelter always regretted that his friend could not attend any of the performances of the motets in the Singakademie. "Could I," he writes, 7th September 1827, "let you hear, some happy day, one of Sebastian Bach's motets, you could feel yourself at the centre of the world, as a man like you ought to be. I hear the works for the many hundredth time, and am not finished with them yet, and never will be." The best work that Zelter did for Bach was when he prevailed upon himself to retire in favour of his pupil Mendelssohn, and allow him to perform the St. Matthew Passion with the chorus of the Singakademie. This had not been easy for him. He was on the point of dismissing with a surly reply the two young people, Edouard Devrient, accompanied Mendelssohn on the difficult errand, who had disturbed him at his work on that January morning in 1829. Mendelssohn already had his band on the door to go. The old man growled something about young cubs who thought themselves capable of anything. But Devrient, from whom the whole plan had come, did not lose heart, and at last brought him round. The success of the work, so far as the singers were concerned, was decided after the first rehearsals. When the two friends set out to engage the soloist, they remarked in front of the opera house how wonderful it was that the Passion should again come to light exactly 100 years after its first performance under Bach, and that an actor and a young Jew should be accountable for it. The performance took place on the 11th March. The chorus numbered about 400. The orchestra was mostly composed of dilettanti in the Philharmonic Society, with leaders of the strings and the wind drawn from the royal band. Sturmer sang the evangelist's music, Devrient that of Jesus, Baader was the Peter, Busold the high priest and Pilate, Wepler, the Judas. The soprano and alto soli were taken by ladies named Schatzel, Mieder, and Thulschmidt. All gave their services free, and relinquished their right to free tickets. The copying out of the parts had been undertaken by Reitz with his brother and his brother-in-law. They too refused any honorarium. Fanny Mendelssohn was angry with Spontini for having accepted 2 free tickets. Mendelssohn, who was then just 20 years old, conducted the whole excellently, although it was the first time he had stood before a large orchestra and chorus. In accordance with the tradition of the Singakademie, he conducted from the piano, his face turned sideways to the audience, so that he had the first choir at his back. To humour Devrient, he beat time only in the intermezzi and the difficult passages, for the rest letting his hand hang quietly by the side. The audience was transported, not only by the work, but also by the fine dynamics of the choir, which was something unusual in those days. Not less powerful was the religious impression made by Bach's music. The crowded hall looked like a church, writes Fanny Mendelssohn. Every one was filled with the most solemn devotion. One heard only an occasional involuntary ejaculation that sprang from deep emotion. On the 21st of March, Bach's birthday, the work was repeated. Spontini had wanted to prevent a further performance, but Mendelssohn and Devrient had gone direct to the Crown Prince, whose orders the all-powerful ruler of the Berlin Opera had to obey. The enthusiasm was, if possible, even greater than before. Mendelssohn, however, was not quite satisfied with the performance. The chorus and the orchestra had indeed done excellently, but in the soli there had been errors made that put him out of humour. On that evening a select company of admirers of Bach was invited to supper at Zelter's, who was now quite reconciled with the undertaking. Frau Edouard Devrient sat next to a man who seemed to her very affected, being continually anxious lest her wide lace-trimmed sleeve should touch the plate. "Do tell me who is the stupid fellow next to me," she said softly to Mendelssohn, who sat close by her. He held his serviette for a moment before his mouth and whispered, "The stupid fellow next to you is the famous philosopher Hegel." Hegel took the warmest interest in Bach, and took the opportunity to refer in his Aesthetic to the master, whose grand, truly Protestant, pithy, yet learned genius we have only lately learned to value again properly. Hegel saw in Bach's music the genuine Raphael-like beauty, in that it had progressed from the merely melodic to the characteristic, though the melodic remains justified as the sustaining and uniting soul. In March 1829, while he was conducting the rehearsals for the St. Matthew Passion, Mendelssohn went to Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, which were then dealing with music. For Schopenhauer, who attributed so great a significance to music, Bach did not exist. He did not fit in with the philosopher's definition of the nature of music. In the early years of the 3rd decade the St. Matthew Passion was produced in a great number of German towns, among them Frankfurt, Breslau, Königsberg, Dresden, and Kassel. Leipzig did not hear it until 1841, when Mendelssohn was working there. The St. John Passion, which was performed for the first time on the 21st of February 1833 in the Berlin Singakademie, had not the same rapid success. The glory of having revived the B minor Mass belongs to Schellble (1789 1837), the founder of the Frankfurt Kechelien Verein. He had performed the Credo as early as 1828, but nobody had taken any notice of it. In 1831 he followed it up with the Kyrie and the Gloria. The Berlin Singakademie gave the first part in 1834, and the whole work, much curtailed, however, in 1835. Schellble did not live to hear the performance of the Christmas oratorio that he had projected. It was not given until 1858. Considered as a whole, Mendelssohn's victory hardly went further than the St. Matthew Passion. The fact that the piano and organ works now interested the public more was the by-product of this victory. We must remember in this connection what Mendelssohn had done for Bach by public performances of these works. The programs of his organ concerts were devoted almost exclusively to Bach. It was he who initiated Schumann into the beauty of the chorale fantasias. Of their favorite chorale prelude, Schmücke dich, o liebe Seele, Schumann writes, "Round the cantus firmus hung golden garlands of leaves," and it was full of such beatitude than you yourself, that is, Mendelssohn, who had played it to him. Confess to me that if life were to deprive you of hope and faith, This one chorale would bring it all back again to you. The cantatas still remained forgotten. Until 1843, the Sing-Akademie had produced only one of them. Perhaps it would have been otherwise if Mendelssohn, as he had hoped, had become Zelter's successor. Things were rather better in Leipzig, where, since the cantorate of August Eberhard Müller (1801 to 1810), and more especially under his successor Johann Gottfried Schicht (1810 to 1823), Bach began to be honored again at St. Thomas's. Mendelssohn, when in Leipzig, did a great deal to introduce Bach into the concert room. The real Bach epoch for the St. Thomas choir began during the cantorate of Moritz Hauptmann (1842 to 1868). At Frankfurt, Schellbler produced the Actus Tragicus (1833) and the cantata Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben (1843), as if he had a presentiment of the early death that was to call him away from his ideal work. In Breslau, Johann Theodor Mosavius (1788 to 1858) performed the cantatas Eine Fürstenburg (1835), Gottes Zeit (1836), Sei Lob und (1837), Wer nur den Leiben, Gott, Last Walton (1839), and the first two parts of the Christmas Oratorio with the Sing-Akademie founded by him in 1825. He also published at the same time, in order to make these works better known, an essay on J. S. Bach in seinen Kirchenkantaten und Choralgesangen. Mosavius is the first great Bach aesthetician after Rochlitz, whose ideas he resumes. He always dwells upon Bach's penetrating musical treatment of the text as the characteristic feature of his art. At the same time he recognizes the pictorial elements in his style, and shows that Bach almost always gives a figurative turn to the spiritual meaning of the words. He thinks that the key to Bach's development is to be found in his passion for pictorial illustration. As he says, Bach represents standing and moving, resting and hurrying, elevation and depression, with a naivete almost characteristic of the first beginning of art. Without abandoning this minute detail painting in his later works, his method now becomes as it were transfigured. His thought, vision, and emotion have remained unchanged. But in the later works the tone painting is not so isolated. It is part and parcel of the melodic form that constitutes the basis of his movements, and his genius provided him with themes that contain in their germ all the possibilities of expression that the movement will afterwards require. In spite of its pictorial character, Mosavius regards Bach's music as genuine church music. Precisely in Sebastian Bach, he says in one place, we can clearly recognize that not this or that style alone can lay claim to the title of a church style, but that only a soul filled with the holiest and highest can speak the language that can bring the most exalted things home to us, and that discards the mean and the unworthy. He therefore concludes that the cantatas are well suited for the church service, and would have been performed at the end of the sermon. Mosavius was the last to criticize Bach impartially. After that the composer is drawn into a conflict of opinions with which he had no concern, and more than a generation had to elapse before men could again contemplate and criticize him purely as he was. The discussion was mainly upon the question of true and false church music. The Reformation in church music, which in the middle of the 19th century was everywhere victorious over the inartistic ideal of pietism and rationalism, was not favourable to Bach. It harked back to the epoch before him, and condemned his cantatas, in common with the whole of the church music of the 18th century, as theatrical art, not calculated for the edification of the faithful. Karl von Winterfeldt undertook the execution of the sentence in his work on Der evangelische Kirchengesang und sein Verhältnis zur Kunst des Tonsatzes. For him the true church style is that of an Eckhart, that aims at the objective, not the subjective, expression of feeling. Bach, however, in spite of the ample piety that is evident in his works, is not a church composer, since his imagination always runs away with him. His art is incomprehensible by the multitude, and he aims at being dramatic. Even the extraordinary impression he makes on the souls of his hearers, and the means by which he effects this, exclude the wonderful work of Bach from the church, which is a place of worship. Winterfeldt did not say this without weighing his words, for he revered Bach. He finally consoles himself with the thought that he can at any rate exempt the organ works from the condemnation, not seeing, as indeed Rochlitz and Mausolus before him had failed to see, that the chorale fantasias are as pictorial in their conception as the cantatas. Thus the church doors were closed to Bach. The church choirs refused to do for the cantatas what the oratorio societies had done in the concert room for the Passions. While it did not occur to these societies to bring to light the treasures hidden in the cantatas, these being works with nothing of the oratorio about them, and not being long enough to fill a programme. Even greater obstacles were placed in the way of the resuscitation of Bach's music by the controversy upon modern and classical art that sprang up around the work of Wagner. The consequent neglect of Bach was almost the least effect of this controversy, and in itself indeed was quite natural, for nowhere has the present such a right to be its own arbiter as in art. What did him harm, however, was the narrow definition of the classical that was put forward in opposition to the Wagnerian style, and to Wagner's manner of interpreting Beethoven. The conservative party maintained that true classical music should concern itself only with perfect form, and the expression of indefinite feeling, and prove its true greatness by avoiding drastic tone painting and far-reaching poetic pretensions. Bach was an old musician, therefore he was a classical musician, therefore he could not have thought otherwise than as one was entitled to assume the classical master's thought. Thus when he was a witness against Wagner, his thoughtless and polemical attitude was accountable for people not trying to find the real Bach, and this just at the time when his works were at last made accessible to the world. The earlier history of the publication of Bach's works is an unpleasant story. None of the hopes were fulfilled that had been built on the scheme for the publication of the complete works, at the beginning of the 19th century, by Hofmeister and Kuhnel, afterwards Peters. Two other publishers, Simrock and Nageli, had had similar plans, but their promises were unredeemed. They could only bring out the works for which there was a market, that is, pianoforte and instrumental compositions. The difficulties in the way of issuing the cantatas were realized by Breitkopf and Hartel when, in 1821, they published Eine Fürsterburg at 1 1/3 thalers per copy. In 1829, Zelter writes to Goethe that they regarded the work as a drug. Such was the fate of the first cantata of Bach's that was offered to the German public. More success fell to the lot of the 6 motets which the same firm had published in 1803 at the instance of Schicht, who afterwards became a St. Thomas cantor. The publication of the Magnificat, Simrock, 1811, in E-flat major instead of D major, went almost unnoticed. After the Berlin performance of the St. Matthew Passion, circumstances seemed to improve. In 1830, the score of this work was published by Schlesinger. In the same year, Simrock printed 6 cantatas: Nimm von uns Herr, Herr deine Augen, ihr werdet weinen und heulen, Du Hirte Israels, Herr gehe nicht ins Gericht, and Gottes Seid. In 1831, Trautwein brought out the St. John Passion. Then the movement was once more checked. Thenceforward, no doubt could exist among musicians that if it were left to the publishers alone, the complete Bach would never appear, but that the work would have to be taken in hand by the community of Bach lovers. Schäuble wrote to this effect to Mendelssohn's friend, the singer Franz Hauser, 1794 to 1870, who had a large collection of Bach autographs and copies. In 1837, Schumann, who had done so much for Bach with his pen, inquired in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik whether it would not be an opportune and useful thing if the German nation were to resolve upon the publication of the complete works of Bach, and he referred to 2 letters of Beethoven that had just been made public, in which the composer had congratulated the publisher Hofmeister on his projected edition of Bach. When in 1843 the formation of the English Handel Society was announced, Schumann remarked in his journal that the time was no longer distant when the plan of a complete Bach edition might be laid before the public. In July 1850, the Bach Gesellschaft came into being. At its head was Moritz Hauptmann, then cantor at St. Thomas's, Otto Jahn, the biographer of Mozart and professor of archaeology at Leipzig, Karl Ferdinand Becker, professor of the organ at the Leipzig Conservatoire, and Schumann. The printing and the financial arrangements were undertaken by Breitkopf and Hartel. From the commencement the undertaking had the greatest difficulties to contend against. There really should have been some years of preparatory labor in order to sift the material and to draw up a clear plan for the edition. It was feared, however, that public interest might slacken if something were not issued at once. Consequently, a start was made with what happened to be ready. In this way, an element of disorder crept in that was never afterwards mastered. The editors lived from hand to mouth. Thus the B minor Mass and the French and English suites were published without any reference to the oldest versions. For the Mass, the autograph, formerly in Nageli's possession, now in the Royal Library in Berlin, which of course necessitated new and corrected editions. At first the members of the committee had thought that voluntary labor would be sufficient to see the edition through. But it soon became evident that the task demanded the whole strength and the whole time of someone. From the ninth year onward, the work developed upon Wilhelm Rust (1822 to 1892), the grandson of the well-known composer Friedrich Wilhelm Rust of Dresden (1739 to 1796), who, with Emanuel Bach, plays an important part in the history of the pianoforte sonata. He superintended the issue with ideal devotion from the ninth until the 28th year. The prefaces which he contributed to the separate volumes are sometimes masterly. They deal not only with critical and historical matters, but with purely practical questions relating to the manner of performing Bach's music. Towards the end he fell off, the task exceeded the powers of one man. The responsibility was also too great for a single person to bear. In 1882 he surrendered the editorship in order to be more equal to his new duties as cantor at St. Thomas's, to which post he had been appointed in 1880. In his place came new forces. Dorfel, Count Waldersee, Naumann, Wöllner. These completed the difficult work in accordance with a prearranged scheme. On the 27th January 1900, the completed final volume, year 46th, was laid before the committee, on which not one of the original founders of the Bach-Gesellschaft was represented. To the very end the work had been carried on in face of an apathetic public. The number of subscribers, of whom there were 350 at the end of the first year, did not increase. Without the enthusiastic labours of Franz Liszt and Hauser, who exerted themselves to fill up the gaps as they arose, the number would not even have remained at that. The financial situation was always so bad that the question of the continuance of the society was raised time after time. Only a few artists realized the magnitude of the undertaking of the Bach-Gesellschaft. Among them was Brahms, who used to say that the two greatest events during his lifetime were the founding of the German Empire and the completion of the Bach edition. The church choirs, whose help had been counted on, did absolutely nothing. It must, however, be admitted that the method of publication was the most unpractical that could have been devised. People had to subscribe for the whole edition and pay for each volume in advance. Single volumes could not be bought separately. The society thus threw away the good business they might have done with separate issues that were in general request, such as the Passions and the piano and organ works, and the general public was not brought into touch with the weighty undertaking. When at last in 1869 it was resolved to sell the volumes separately, at 30 marks per volume, that is, double the subscription price, it was too late. The press practically ignored the work. The history of the publication of Bach's works is thus a repetition of the history of his own life. The undertaking of the Bach-Gesellschaft was supplemented by the work of one man, Spita's Life of Bach, of which the first volume appeared in 1874, the second in 1880. For the first time the world had a real biography of the master. Before Forkel's book, writers on the subject had simply reproduced the necrology, with more or less of their own fantasy. After Forkel they were content to gather together the existing information. No one had issued a work adequate to the historical questions involved. Peter (1813 to 1885), afterwards Prussian Minister of Finance, had indeed set himself this aim in his book on Bach (1865), without succeeding in getting beyond dilettantism. Spita's work is really a unique performance among artistic biographies. It is rarely that the first scientific investigator of an art epoch leaves so little for his successors to do as in this case. He not only awoke Bach to new life, but vivified the whole world in which Bach had worked. It was, indeed, not a work for the average reader, nor a book for musicians to refer to casually. For this it was too exclusively scientific, and not always simple and clear enough in its plan, the author having worked too closely together the story of Bach's life, an analysis of his works, and an account of contemporary art. Only those who had the time and the enthusiasm to follow him in his tortuous path could really appreciate the depths and the many beauties of the work. It was predestined to serve as a storehouse of material for writers of Bach biographies of the popular kind. Nor was it wholly satisfactory to musicians on the aesthetic side. It contains indeed many admirable analyses, couched in poetic language. There are some which no one who reads them can ever forget. But the aesthetic viewpoint is too subordinate to the historical, and owing to the plan of the book, the essential artistic quality of Bach's art is never presented as a whole. René de Récy has formulated this approach most clearly in the Revue des Deux Mondes for 1885. Spita saw that Bach's aesthetic was no longer so simple as in the time of Mausolus. He is too obviously bent on holding up the Cantor of St. Thomas's as representative of pure music, as an exemplar to the erring artists of his own day. The historical inquiry had prejudiced the aesthetic. So it was, again, with the subsequent biographies that were based on Spita. They do not complete him on the artistic side in the desired way, and they are too much under his influence in another respect, following him in the plan of mixing up the biography with analyses of the works. There is not the slightest reason for this with Bach. In the case of no other artist has the external course of his life so little to do with the origin of his works, or is what we know of his life so insignificant, and as regards his personal experience so uninteresting. Still we are bound to recognize how much these popular biographies of Bach have done for him. Those whom, according to Hauptmann, the promoters of the collected edition of Bach's works had principally in view, actually profited by it least. Though correct scores of the cantatas were from the very beginning issued at the rate of something like 10 each year, performances of them were hardly more frequent than before. Matters did not improve in this respect until the Bach societies sprang up in various towns. In Vienna, whither the St. Matthew Passion had penetrated, in 1862, Brahms, as conductor of the local Singverein, exerted himself on behalf of the cantatas. In our own time, Robert Franz fought for them with his pen. The Passions, after about 1860, were taken up in most towns. For the piano compositions Franz Liszt continued the work that Mendelssohn had begun, and by brilliant transcriptions of the organ compositions, especially of the G minor and A minor fugues, forced Bach as an organ composer on the public attention. The Peters edition carried the preludes, fugues, and chorale preludes into every church about the middle of the 40s. A landmark in the victorious course of Bach was afforded by the inauguration of the Eisenach Memorial in 1885, where the reverence of the artists who assembled round Liszt found public expression. It was well known that Wagner was an admirer of Bach. He regarded him as the great teacher of Beethoven, who cut himself loose from Haydn as the youth developed into the man. He had thus expressed in his essay, What is German? The significance of Bach for German spiritual life. If we would comprehend the wonderful originality, strength, and significance of the German mind in one incomparably eloquent image, we must look keenly and discerningly at the appearance, otherwise almost inexplicably mysterious, of the musical marvel, Sebastian Bach. He is the history of the inner life of the German mind during the awful century when the German people was utterly extinguished. Look at this head, hidden in its absurd French full-bottomed wig. Look at this master, a miserable cantor and organist in little Thuringian towns whose names we hardly know now, wearing himself out in poor situations, always so little considered that it needed a whole century after his death to rescue his works from oblivion. Even in his music, taking up with an art form which externally was the complete likeness of his epoch, dry, stiff, pedantic, like perukes and pigtails in notes. And see now the world, the incomprehensibly great Sebastian, built up out of these elements. To these creations I only refer briefly, since it is impossible to characterize by any comparison whatever their wealth, their grandeur, and their all-embracing significance. Unfortunately, Wagner nowhere discusses the nature of Bach's art more thoroughly or fixes his aesthetic impression of it. Nor must it be overlooked that, for Wagner, Bach's cantatas hardly ranked as true church music, of which his own ideal was pure chorale song with occasional organ accompaniment. He regards the addition of instruments as the beginning of the decline of this branch of the art, which explains why Wagner often speaks of Bach's motets but hardly mentions the cantatas. But it was in his works rather than in his words that he prepared the way for Bach. From them the world learned again to look for a profound inner relation between word and tone in the musical setting of poetry. The outcome of Wagner's art was a revolution of the whole musical consciousness. The hearer became exigent. Henceforth only the true characteristic in music could satisfy him, only the truly dramatic could move him. Thus a whole mass of music sank slowly into the abyss of oblivion, and by the side of the music drama of Wagner, the dramatic religious music of Bach came out in clear light. Warring as Wagner did against the beautiful in music, he was at the same time, though unconsciously, fighting for Bach, whose pithy and often most poetical conception of the text in the motets astonished him. It is only now, after the strife is over, that we can see the importance of the victory. The magnitude of the change of view makes it wholly incomprehensible to us how the post-Beethovenian epoch could remain insensible to the greatness of Bach, and how even those who planned the great Bach edition could make a distinction between the pleasing and the unpleasing works. Bach numbered from the beginning many admirers among French musicians, as was shown by their ardent cooperation in the subscription for the collected edition. Among them was Gounod, whose understanding of Bach must not be estimated merely by his dubious arrangement of the C major prelude, and the older school of French organists. Saint-Saëns must indubitably be reckoned among the best Bach connoisseurs. And the same may be said of Gabriel Fauré, Gimond, Widor and Gigoux, the creators of modern French organ music derived directly from Bach. The violinist Charles Bouvet, with his little Bach Society, worked hard for the instrumental works. The Paris performance of the St. Matthew Passion by the Concordia Society under Widor in 1885 was a decisive point in the public recognition of Bach. The Schola Cantorum under Vincent d'Indy and Bordes gave excellent performances of some of the cantatas. This again was a special object of the Paris Bach Society, begun under the auspices of Fauré and Widor, the conductor of which, Gustave Brett, is chiefly bent on organizing a capable choir, perhaps the most difficult of the undertaking in Paris. The lack of mixed choirs is, generally speaking, the greatest obstruction to the diffusion of Bach's works in France. Many years may still elapse before a change is made in this respect, and the Bach of the cantatas becomes more widely known. Excellent Bach translations have been made by, among others, Maurice Bouchot and Madame Henriette Fuchs. A uniform translation of the whole of the cantatas is being prepared by G. Brett, the conductor of the Bach Society. In France, as a matter of fact, we can best realize how Wagner had prepared the way for Bach. The enthusiasm for Bach sprang up when the Wagner enthusiasm that had finally become little more than a fashion had spent itself, and the conviction arose that there was something alien to French artistic feeling in Wagner's union of poetry and music. It was precisely at this stage that Bach came on the scene. Every year it became more obvious how largely his system of musical characterization coincides with French artistic perceptions. His characterization is wholly plastic, whereas the monumental formlessness of Wagner sets an ever-widening gulf between him and the French genius. Even French military music has come under the influence of Bach. In order to make the chorale preludes accessible to the people, Monsieur T. Barnier, chef de musique of the 15th Regiment of Infantry in Bordeaux, has arranged them for military band and plays them at promenade concerts. England has this advantage over France, that it possesses exceptionally fine choruses. The future will show how the contest there between Bach and Handel will end. That the musical saint of the English is regarded on the continent as decidedly inferior to Bach cannot be denied. And the general experience is that cultivation of the cantatas of the one leads to something like injustice to the oratorios of the other, which, a couple of decades ago, completely dominated the musical world. Mendelssohn in this respect shares the fate of Handel. In Belgium, the indefatigable Gevaert fought Bach's battle with great success. Bach triumphed also in Rome. At first many of his works were produced privately by Herr von Keudel. Frau Professor Helbig and Frau Dr. Mengarini. Alessandro Costa rehearsed the B minor Mass with a small chorus recruited from these circles. In the spring of 1889, the whole of higher Roman society was invited to a performance of the Mass in the oratory in the Via Belsiana. In his Trionfo della Morte, 1894, Gabriele D'Annunzio gives a picture of the public at this memorable performance and the impression it made. The Roman Bach Society dates from the year 1895. All this, however, constitutes only the external history of Bach's victory. To estimate its true magnitude, we must look in the scores of the composers of the 19th century. Since Mendelssohn, every composer of any significance has been to school to Bach, not as a pedantic teacher, but to one who impels them to strive after the truest and clearest expression, and to achieve impressiveness not by the wealth of the means they employ, but by the pregnancy of their themes. In Wagner, the spirit of Bach is most evident in the score of the Meistersinger. An interesting Bach renaissance is visible in the consummate polyphony of Max Reger. How Bach will influence modern orchestral compositions cannot yet be seen. Only this much is clear, that he will lead us back to a certain simplicity, and will develop in a quite extraordinary way the sense of form of future generations. As regards the present-day esteem of Bach, we must beware of taking all verbal enthusiasm for reality. Since it ceased to be a risk and became a recommendation to swear by Bach, lip service has been plentiful. Much of what is said of him represents no personal experience at all, but is a mere echo of the experience of others. How far have we really got? He is clearly influencing domestic music. This is beyond dispute. The inventions, the suites, and the well-tempered clavichord have become the property of the people. What the average amateur of the present day lacks in theoretical musical education is supplied for him by these works of Bach, from which he unconsciously imbibes certain principles of thematic formation, of part writing, of modulation and of construction, and from which he acquires a certain unconscious critical faculty that protects him against inferior art. As regards our public music, the conditions are not so satisfactory. To expect to hear the complete Bach in our concert rooms would be to experience many disappointments. Our pianoforte virtuosi give us transcriptions of the organ works rather than original piano compositions, on what grounds is not apparent. Why must it always be the A minor prelude and fugue that is given to the public? Even in Liszt's arrangement they are merely makeshifts on the piano. Where can we hear, except rarely, performances of the suites, the well-tempered clavichord, the Italian concerto, the chromatic fantasia, the piano concerto in A minor, the C major concerto for two pianos? Where are the Brandenburg orchestral concertos and the orchestral suites securely fixed in our programs? Where are Bach's secular cantatas regularly given? Statistics of Bach performances in our concert programs would bring some curious facts to light, and would show that there are not too many towns where the auditor can really get to know Bach. The church cantatas stand in a category of their own. Even where the Passions are regularly given, there are certain difficulties in the way of producing the cantatas. It looks as if their title were against them. Many conductors who have vowed themselves to the service of Bach think it injudicious to place cantatas on their programs, with the exception of the one or two that have become classics. They do not strike these people as sufficiently decorative. When, however, one of them takes it into his head to devote a whole evening to the cantatas, he has to invoke all the muses and all the saints against his choral committee, who are afraid that the program will not draw, or that it offers too little variety. One often believes oneself back in the days, it was in 1858, when so excellent an institution as the Hamburg Bach Society, terrified lest there might be too much Bach in the program, arranged it in this way: an 8-part motet by Bach, Chopin's Berceuse, the Hall of Song scenes from Tannhauser in a piano arrangement, Bach's chorale Jesu meine Freude. Latterly the question has been sharply debated whether the cantatas should be given elsewhere than in church. A paper read at the second Bach Festival 1904 took for its motto, "The church works of Bach for the church." The demand seems at bottom just, and yet is false. Bach's cantatas today could only in quite exceptional cases be given in the course of the church service. and it is neither to be expected nor to be wished that the service should be so altered as to restore the old Leipzig conditions. The independent position of music in the ritual at that time was, as a matter of fact, something quite unnatural in itself, and only explicable by peculiar historical circumstances. The evolution of things has led to a separation between the church service and art that is good for both of them. We have the service on one side, and on the other the sacred concert, or whatever name people may prefer to call it by. The ideal for the present day is really a sacred concert, composed of 3 or 4 Bach cantatas, selected for the appropriateness of their text to the ecclesiastical season. Pure Bach services of this kind should have the preference over the liturgical celebrations that are grouped round a Bach cantata. Yet here again opinions differ. It should be observed, however, that under these circumstances the church must no longer be regarded as a sacred place. If the church for any reason is not available, the performances can be transferred to the concert room without their religious character being affected thereby. How can Bach help it if churches are often so built today that no chorus and no orchestra can be placed in them, or only in such a way that the chorus sings into the backs of the audience? The great point is that Bach, like every lofty religious mind, belongs not to the church, but to religious humanity, and that any room becomes a church in which his sacred works are performed and listened to with devotion. It follows that everything that might disturb the audience must be avoided, and that a single cantata in a program of other works is no use, either a cantata evening or no cantata at all. Wherever such cantata evenings have been ventured upon, their success has shown that all the fears for them, real or imaginary, were groundless. In comparison with the cantatas, everything else that Bach has done appears as hardly more than a supplement. So long as the public has heard only the Passions, the Mass, and the Christmas Oratorio, we cannot say that the whole Bach is ours again. He is not yet known, and will not be until then. History and criticism have done almost all for him that can be done. It is time for the aesthetic to take the place of the historical, time to try to comprehend the nature of Bach's art in its whole depth and its rich multifariousness. The necessity also becomes more and more urgent for more exact investigation into the musical practice of Bach's time. From this quarter much interesting light is yet to be thrown. We need it. The deeper we go into the question of how Bach should be performed, the more complicated it becomes. It breaks up into a number of questions of detail, which can be solved only by historical gleanings and by ever-repeated practical trials. For the elucidation of these questions, as well as for the spreading of a wider general knowledge of Bach, much is to be hoped for from the triennial Bach festivals planned by the Bach-Gesellschaft. The hope seems justifiable. The 4 that have already been held have done much to stimulate interest. It is certain, however, that Bach festivals and everything else that we can do ad gloriam Bachi are not what are finally needed most, but the quiet, modest work of thousands of unknown men, who go to Bach for nothing more than their own inner satisfaction, and love to communicate these riches to their neighbors. Only to people like these will he truly reveal himself. End of chapter 12. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.